Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm excited to share some of this work with you all. This is a newer area for me. As you heard from my bio, my work has focused primarily on higher education finance, policy, and politics, and this isn't really any of those, but my work on higher education policy implementation really motivated this work and got me interested in the use of predictive analytics in higher education, particularly to improve college student success. So that's sort of the tie-in to some of my previous work. Special thanks to Bridget Gooseby for inviting me and to Sam for helping organize this event. And a few more acknowledgements before I get started. First, this research was co-led with a wonderful colleague, Dr. Hidi Sanahide, who is an industrial engineer at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we've worked in collaboration with several colleagues with Dr. Matthew Eisen, Anuja Tayal, and Francesco De Carlo. And this research was funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. The opinions expressed are those of the authors and do not represent the views of the Institute at the Department of Education. And in addition, of course, we're grateful for the support of the Population Research Center, and the content is solely, again, the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes for Health. So here's how I'll organize my talk for today. I'll start with some background related to predictive analytics in higher education, and then I'll present briefly on two studies that are related to each other. The second builds on the first. Both are works in progress, and so I very much welcome any feedback, questions, suggestions that you might have as we continue to develop this work. Okay, so first for a little bit of background. As some of you may know, colleges and universities are increasingly using prediction algorithms to aid in various decisions. And this covers many domains within higher education, from admissions to financial aid allocations to budgeting within colleges and universities, academic advising, as well as student success interventions. Now, some of these prediction models that are used in colleges and universities are built within the institution. So there are institutional researchers or data scientists that are employed by the university who develop these algorithms, but some of them are outsourced. So there's a growing industry of vendors who provide these predictive algorithms to colleges and universities for these various use cases. One very common application of predictive analytics is to predict college student success. And the outputs of these models often label students according to their level of risk of failure. So in some cases, it's just a classification model that says this student is at risk of failure or is not at risk of failure, with just a binary outcome. In other cases, there's actually a risk score assigned to each student. And specifically, models used to predict college student success use algorithms. They use machine learning algorithms, and they use data on both current and past students on predictors that include academic performance, both from high school and from college, demographic characteristics, course taking patterns, and even student engagement on learning management systems. So a lot of these algorithms use data on how many times a student clicks on Canvas on a particular page. There's lots of other data that are used that I don't even include on here, including student ID swipes in dining halls and residence halls, how late students come back into their dorms. I mean, it's really striking when you really start to learn all the data that are collected on our students and how they're used, including to predict college student success. Now, the outputs of these models can be used in numerous ways. Okay, so they can be used to provide insights for academic advisors. That's one very common use of predictive analytics, of student success prediction specifically. And academic advisors can use them for course planning, so they can help students think about which courses they should take. They can also be used to prompt contact. So the prediction might prompt an advisor to reach out to a student if the student is at risk of failure, of not completing a course, or of not returning the following semester. The prediction model may prompt the advisor to reach out to that student and see what's going on, to try to intervene. Some of these models also send direct messages to students. who are at risk. So for example, prediction models can be used within Canvas or other learning management systems, and they might automatically send a message to students if a student is deemed at risk of not succeeding in the course. And it could send them reminders of deadlines, a reminder that an exam is coming up, a link to resources, etc. Another use is, and I think this one is less well known, recommending courses or majors to students. So based on the student's prediction of success in different majors, the prediction algorithm might give insights either to the academic advisor or directly to the student on the student's likelihood of success in a particular course or major. And that might steer the student away from a major that's considered more rigorous and towards another major where their likelihood of success might be higher. And finally, these algorithms can also be used to inform targeted interventions. So to calculate the likelihood that a student is going to succeed and to target interventions to students with the greatest need or with the highest risk of failure. And in fact, I know that at UT we've used these predictive models in this way to offer additional supports to students. So to offer more financial aid, to offer more academic advising, to enroll students in student success programs to help them succeed. Okay, so just here's a visual just so you can see kind of what it looks like. This is a user interface for one of these prediction models from EAB. This is called EAB Navigate. And on that side, you can see that is a user interface for a faculty member. And I know it's a bit small, but it lists 4 students, student A, B, C, and D. And it just has a label for each student at risk or not. And then there's an option for the faculty member to send a message to the student. Especially if they see that a student is at risk, the faculty member can easily just click, send a message, and contact the student. And here's another interface. This one is for academic advisors. And this one shows the full profile for a single student. It shows different metrics, and it shows their predicted level of risk, which in this case is high. Okay, so there's a lot of enthusiasm surrounding predictive analytics in higher education. But as y'all might already be starting to think, there are also some concerns with fairness in these predictions, right? And the term algorithmic fairness is a specific term in computer science related to machine learning. And so that's the term that I use here. But of course, there are so many different ways to define fairness. And here I'm really talking about the statistical notion of fairness. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But there are some concerns that because machine learning algorithms learn patterns based on historical data, they make predictions based on those patterns. If the historical data contain biases or reflect social inequalities, these biases will be learned by the model. And the predictions that the model makes can perpetuate those biases, right? So if students who are racially minoritized are less likely to be successful historically, then the model will predict that racially minoritized students are less likely to succeed. And this is for new students using data on previous students, okay? So this quote captures some of these concerns with predictive analytics in higher education, especially for student success prediction. It says, early alert and program recommender systems that disproportionately flag low-income students of color for poor achievement or steer them away from more challenging and or economically lucrative majors send the message that they do not have what it takes. So there are a couple of things to note here. If the algorithms are biased and they're used for course or major recommendations, they could be producing or reproducing curriculum tracking in higher education, right? But then there's also this potential psychological effect on the student, sending the message that the student is at risk, has a low probability of success, that could have a negative impact on the student. Okay, so with that background, given the potential discriminatory impact of college student success predictions, one of the 2 working papers that I'll present on today aims to detect and mitigate algorithmic bias in student success prediction. So in the first study I present, we explore unfairness in algorithms that predict college student success. And specifically, we examine how the accuracy of the predictions vary between racial and ethnic groups? Do the models do a better job of predicting success for certain racialized groups than others? And if so, or if not, how do the errors in the predictions differ between racialized groups? Now, in the full paper, we also explore different mitigation strategies to try to reduce the bias that we detect in the algorithms, but I won't be presenting those results today. So briefly, the reason we focus on racialized biases here is because of historical racialized inequities in educational attainment, which could affect the predictions. And specifically, the predictive accuracy of the models could differ, could be better for racially advantaged groups for various reasons. For example, the underrepresentation of minoritized groups with successful outcomes. So if in the historical data, there are fewer racially minoritized students who are labeled as successful, then that could lead to biases in the predictions. There may also be more errors in the data for racially minoritized students. And the models might omit variables that are more predictive of success for racially minoritized students, such as family support, distance from home, discriminatory experiences on campus or in the classroom, culturally relevant practices in pedagogy. So these are all factors that we know influence student success for racially minoritized students, but usually we don't have data on all of these variables that can be included in the models. So there might be a greater omitted variable bias for racially minoritized students. The variables that are included in these models might be better predictors of success for racially advantaged students. So for this study, we use data from the Education Longitudinal Study of 2002, which is a nationally representative longitudinal study. And it tracks students who were 10th graders in 2002, that's the base year. And it followed them for 10 years, so 8 years after expected high school graduation. The analytic sample includes only students who ever attended a four-year institution. So here we're defining success as bachelor's degree attainment or higher. So we limit the sample to only those students who ever attended a four-year university. Our dependent variable is bachelor's degree attainment 8 years after expected high school graduation. And it is a classification problem, so we convert the dependent variable into a binary variable. It takes a value of 1 if the student did attain a bachelor's degree or higher within 8 years after expected high school graduation, and a value of 0 otherwise. For our independent variables or our predictors in the model, we include features that are commonly used for student success prediction. And in the ELS dataset, we have lots of those. So we have 29 variables that, based on previous literature in higher education, we know are predictors of college student success. For the machine learning models, we split the data, 80% training to train the models, 20% to test the models, and we average results across 30 different random splits. Okay, so there are a few different notions, there are different ways to conceptualize fairness. And we use 4 different statistical notions of fairness in our analyses, because depending on the use case, different notions of fairness are more relevant. So for example, equal opportunity refers to differences in false negative rates between groups, okay? And with equal opportunity, we might think of it from the perspective of course recommendations. So if there are higher false negative rates for racially minoritized students, that means those students are more likely to be steered away from more rigorous majors. So what I mean by that is false negative rates are predicting failure for students who actually succeeded. So that's when the prediction model is making a mistake, because it's predicting failure for students who actually succeeded. So that would lead to higher false negative rates for those groups, right? So that's the equal opportunity notion. It's just subtracting the difference between that false negative rate for the sensitive group. Sensitive group is in our case, it's racially minoritized students, minus the false negative rate for the racially advantaged group. Okay. That's different from false positive rates, which is predictive equality, right? False positive rates is actually predicting success for students who actually failed. And so we're less concerned about higher false positive rates for racially minoritized students from an equity perspective than we are concerned about false negative rates. Theoretically, although we could talk about that, about whether there are some scenarios in which we would worry about higher false positive rates for racially minoritized students. And then equalized odds is, in order to have parity with equalized odds, you have to have equal false positive and false negative rates across the groups. Okay. So these are the three notions that really focus on that predictive accuracy. So we tried 4 different machine learning models for robustness tests, logistic regression, decision trees, random forest, and support vector machine. And to evaluate the model performance, we look at the mean and variance of accuracy, as well as the unfairness using the notions that I shared in the previous slide. I will say my background is not in machine learning. It's not my expertise. My collaborator is very much the technical expert on these models. So if you have questions specifically about the models, happy to try to answer them, but also could refer you to me. Okay, so these are our findings. Okay, so these are box plots, and I know box plots can sometimes be a little unintuitive, but these are showing the statistical parity of the baseline without any mitigation strategies for our 4 different machine learning models. So the different colors represent the different machine learning models, but generally you can see similar patterns across the groups regardless of the model that we used. Okay. So what we see here, statistical parity, is just the difference in the actual predicted outcomes. So we see higher predicted outcomes for Asian and white students than for Black and Hispanic students. 2+ means 2 or more races in the ELS data set. But in general, we see higher predicted outcomes, so higher rates of success of attaining a bachelor's degree for Asian and white students, and lower predicted outcomes for Black and Hispanic students, which isn't entirely surprising because we know that there are lower attainment rates for Black and Hispanic students than there are for Asian and white students, right? And the model learns that, and in the predictions it makes in the future, it predicts that Asian and white students are more likely to succeed than Black and Hispanic students, right? But this doesn't tell us anything about the accuracy of the model, about the kinds of errors the model is making. So for that, we turn to our next notions of fairness. So this one is equal opportunity. This is looking at those false negative rates, which again, that's predicting failure for students who actually succeeded. So the model is making a mistake by predicting failure for students who actually succeeded. And here we see kind of the opposite pattern where we see higher false negative rates for Black and Hispanic students and lower false negative rates for Asian and white students. Okay. And specifically, well, I can return to the measure if you have any specific questions about what's actually represented on the y-axis, but it's that difference in false negative rates between each individual racialized group and all other groups. So this is showing Hispanic versus all other groups. What's the false negative rate for Hispanics as compared to all other groups? And you can see it's slightly higher for Black and Hispanic and slightly lower for Asian and white. And to give you a concrete example, so I mentioned earlier we used 30 different random splits of the data in splitting the data between training data that was used to test the model and testing data. So if we look at a single random split, which is one of those splits, among the students who completed their degree, so if we condition the data set to those who were successful, who completed their degree, the probability of failure for those who succeeded is 4.6% for white, so relatively low. It's 5.5% for Asian. For Hispanic, it's 20%. So among students who succeeded, the probability of failure, predicted probability of failure for Hispanic students is 20%. And for Black students, it's 8%. Again, that's in a single split of the data. And the results we show here is averaging across 30 different random splits. Okay, and these are the results for false positive rates. So this is for the predictive equality notion of fairness. And here, again, we see that generally for white students, we have much, much higher false positive rates. So this is predicting success for students who actually failed. For students who didn't complete their bachelor's degree, the model predicted that they did succeed, that they did complete their degree at much higher rates than all other groups. And we can see lower rates for Black and Hispanic, with Asian somewhere in between. And here again, for a concrete example, in a single split of the data, among those students who did not complete their degree, so all the students whose bachelor's degree attainment was, who did not attain their bachelor's degree, the likelihood of completing the degree is estimated at 78% for white students among those who didn't complete. 78% for white students, 83% for Asian students, 33% for Hispanic students, and 0% for Black students. So no false positive rates for Black students in that single split of the data. Okay. So I don't know if this is easier to interpret or harder to interpret. This paper is it's a revise and resubmit at a journal currently, and we got some feedback from the Sociology of Education group about a week or two ago. And one of the suggestions was to present the results using confusion matrices, but I don't know if it's more confusing or less confusing with the confusion matrices. But so it's just another way to try to interpret the results. And so what we see here on the x-axis, we see the predicted values, right? So we trained these models, and the models gave us a prediction. Either the students will not succeed or they will succeed. Mm-hmm. So it's either a value of 0 or a value of 1 based on the prediction models. And then we have the actual values from the real data. Did the students succeed or not? Okay, so in the top left corner, we have those true negatives. That's where the model got it right. The model predicted that students would not succeed, and in fact, students did not succeed. Okay, so we see that true negative rates are much higher for Hispanic and Black students. So for Hispanic students, true negative rates are 22% of all of the predictions. And for Black students, true negative rates are 35% of all of the predictions. And they're much lower for white students. 12% of all of the predictions are true negatives. And for Asian students, 8% of the predictions are true negatives. Now, these are the false negatives. Again, this is where the model predicts failure for students who actually succeeded. And we see higher false negative rates for Hispanic students. The highest proportion is for Hispanic students at 8.7%. And the lowest is for white students at 4.19%. Again, this is for students who actually succeeded, but the model predicted that they failed. Here we see true positives, and true positives are much more common among white and Asian students. And false positives, here the magnitude of the disparities isn't as large in this random split, but false positives, again, predicting success for students who actually failed, are most common among Asian students and least common among Black students. Okay, so in conclusion, we do detect some disparities in college student success predictions across racialized groups. And it's not just that we see lower predicted outcomes for racially minoritized students, but we see that the model is performing better for racially advantaged students than it is for racially minoritized students. We see that the predictive accuracy is higher for racially advantaged students than it is for racially minoritized students. Now, these disparities, they differ between fairness notions, right? So we looked at different fairness notions, and the disparities differ. In some cases, Hispanic students are more disadvantaged. In other cases, Black students are more disadvantaged. And so this highlights the importance of considering both different fairness notions in practice and also of disaggregating the data as much as possible rather than using aggregated data on, for example, just racially advantaged and just racially minoritized groups. And these disparities can have disparate consequences that perpetuate inequalities in higher education if, for example, course or major recommendations are based on the predictive outcomes of these algorithms. The other thing that's important to note is that most users of these algorithms, so academic advisors, faculty members, are not aware of these biases. I mean, we know very little about what actually goes into these models, and we certainly generally are not thinking about the potential of these models to give us biased predictions, which then inform our practice that could lead to more inequitable outcomes. All right, so that is the first paper. I'll stop there and I'll see if there are any questions or reactions.
Maybe this is like I am not super well versed with this data set. Maybe it's just like the nature of the data set. But I guess I have some questions. The first is like the racial category with including Hispanic as a distinct race. I don't know, is it considered a race in the data set, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so it's race ethnicity, the race ethnicity variable, and it is Hispanic. That's the category. So those are the 4 categories that we have access to in the data set, which is not great. It's also still an aggregate category that could be disaggregated further based on race and ethnicity. And then the Asian category too is just, it really, you could do a lot better. But these are the categories that we have to look with in the data set.
And also for the one slide about comparing, I think the box plot comparing each group like relative to all other groups combined. Did you do the same thing like with each group relative to just like white students, or?
We haven't done that yet. So we have some other results where we aggregate further, where we have one group for racially advantaged and one group for racially minoritized, and we call it privileged and unprivileged groups. And the results are similar, but it does obfuscate a lot of the variation that we see when we break it up further. But we haven't compared each group to the white category.
I have a question about the similarity of the data set that you're using to the types of data that are used to actually train these algorithms as I think practice. Like, is it comparable? Like, what sort of, I know you mentioned some more like some weirder stuff of like, scanning into the dorms or whatever. Like,
It's an excellent question. So we have very limited information on what actually goes into these algorithms, because a lot of them, so the ones that are created by these vendors like EAD, Civitas, other organizations, those are proprietary. And so they won't allow you to see what actually goes into them. There have been some like exposés, like journalistic pieces that try to get at some of that, but it's all just kind of anecdotal. We're looking at individual cases. So I don't think we have a good landscape analysis of what kinds of variables go into these models. We just have a lot of anecdotes. And there are some sort of systematic literature reviews that have looked at what do we know so far about. There are studies that look at individual institutions and their models. And then there are systematic literature reviews that review those studies of individual institutions and their models. And so that's how we know like the sorts of things that go into these models. And it's usually the more common ones that we know of are demographic characteristics. Sometimes race is included, sometimes race is not, which is my next paper. The academic achievement, both at the high school level and at the college level. And a lot of times, if the data are available, these more behavioral type features like student engagement on learning management systems. For the ELS data set, that's a huge omission. We don't have any data on learning management system engagement, but also that data is really, really messy. We've talked to people here at UT about that who are trying to use those data, and it's really bad. And I mean, you can think of all the problems with measurement error with students clicking on things for various reasons. It doesn't mean that you're more engaged because you clicked more or less, but that's a side note. So it's a really good question. We don't have a good understanding of what actually goes into these models, but what we have is kind of the best available and a large nationally representative data set.
There was a recent article about Dartmouth and predicting basically how well its minority students will do. And their approach wasn't to compare the students, minority students to students from previous times or from within the institution. They were looking at ways of approaching, how did the minoritized students compare to their origin populations? How well did they succeed in overcoming the kinds of disadvantages they had relative to where they were? So is your approach mostly internal? Because it seems like the Dartmouth approach would be an interesting case study as a comparison.
Can you say more about that, the origin population?
What neighborhoods they came from,
Yeah.
you know, what schools they went to,
Uh-huh.
those kinds of
Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah.
So it was less about comparing them to their
Yeah.
compatriots within Dartmouth. It was more about comparing them with their compatriots from what, maybe they came from
Yeah.
Brooklyn or someplace like that.
Yeah. So in this model, we do have some of those contextual features like beyond the individual. So we do have some data on the high schools that they attended. We don't have zip code yet in the model that we're thinking about including something like that. But we do have information on the schools that they attended, different variables related to the schools.
This is in Times, New York Times or the Washington Post, so.
Okay,
just-
yeah. Yeah,
I
thanks
thought
for
I'd be
mentioning that.
interested to.
Yeah.
Because they've kind of broken away from the pack.
Yeah, I'll check that out. Thank you.
This is very interesting. I have one question and then just wanted to get your reaction. The one question is, you talked about basically the central tendency in the predictive nature of these models, right? Are they more or less likely to be predictive? But what I noticed in your box and whisker plots is the variance is hugely different, different as well. And in a way, doesn't that say that the error, the potential for an error in prediction is much higher for Black students and Latino students? And maybe that's because there are fewer students to train the, I don't know if you have any insights about that, but I keep wondering if somehow there aren't important implications about the variance.
That's a really good point. We do make a note of that in the paper, but it's just one line that's on the higher variance for the racially minoritized students. And it is partly because the N is smaller for those groups. We have fewer observations for those groups, but it also means that across the different random splits of the data, we get more different results for racially minoritized students, which does introduce more, or it does reflect more probability of error. So that feels more,
Would have that same variance. I mean,
it's possible.
a place like UT.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
The other thing is just not to slow the next presentation down, but as you were talking about the reasons that there could be sources of error, one was the discriminatory processes in higher education. And I don't think he estimated this for minoritized students, but Raj Chetty has that database of social mobility for essentially all higher ed institutions and rates them according to how much social mobility they enable. And I'm wondering if you could link that to the iPad.
Oh, that's interesting.
And actually estimate something about an institutional effect. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, I really like that. So yes, linking to iPads is not in here yet, but linking to iPads is one of our next steps. But I hadn't thought about the social mobility data. I think that's a great suggestion, as well as others like related to campus climate too, that would get more directly at some of that discriminatory institutional effect on individuals. Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. All right, so I'll move on to the next study. And this study explores the interplay between race and student success outcomes in machine learning models. And specifically in this working paper, we're tackling the question of whether race variables should be included in models to predict college student success. So we're evaluating the impact of including or excluding race variables on both the accuracy of the models and the prediction and the fairness of the models. And the motivation for this is that, well, lots of different motivations. It's just part of a larger debate about whether you should include sensitive attributes like race in prediction models. But here's this one article that really suggests they found that students, that these universities, including Texas A&M, were predicting failure at a higher rate for Black students. And if you read the article, they really are assuming that the reason for that bias is that race is included in the models. And to us, that wasn't obvious. Is the bias coming from the inclusion of a race variable in the models, or is it something else? Does it matter if you include or exclude the race variable? So there are arguments in favor of race-aware models in the broader machine learning, computer science literature that say some of them are kind of echo arguments related to affirmative action or just race-conscious decision-making, that it's necessary to understand and combat social inequities. We need to see the impact of race, specifically of the race variable, to understand and combat social inequities. And from a technical standpoint, proponents of race-aware models, meaning of including race variables in prediction models, say that that might augment the predictive accuracy of the models by including a predictor that is relevant for, in this case, student success prediction. But arguments against race-aware models are that when you include race, there's a potential for reinforcing stereotypes or existing biases, like we saw in the previous paper. And also an argument against including race variables is that race is not an actionable variable. So if you do find that race is an important predictor in the model, what do you do about that? You can't change a student's race, right? So they argue that the inclusion of such attributes adds little value since they're not malleable. So in this paper, again, we explore the impact of including or excluding a race in machine learning models for predicting student success with a very limited measures of race that we have here. And the three questions that we ask is, how does including race variables impact the accuracy and fairness of the prediction? How important are race variables in college student success prediction? How much are these variables contributing to the models? And our third question is, to what extent are race variables statistically associated with other predictors of college student success in the models? So first, how does including race variables impact the accuracy and fairness of the prediction? So for this question, we use Pareto frontiers because that allows us to evaluate and visualize that trade-off between accuracy and fairness. So we can see accuracy and fairness simultaneously and how the inclusion or exclusion of the race variables affects both the accuracy and the fairness of the models. And again, we have our 4 machine learning models, and we consider different fairness notions that I introduced in the previous paper. So our key findings are, first, there's a significant trade-off between fairness and accuracy. So as the fairness of the model increases, the accuracy of the model does decrease. And that's regardless of whether you include a race variable or not. But the trade-off is minimally altered by the inclusion of race. So race has a minimal effect on both accuracy, fairness, and the trade-off between the two. So this is what it looks like. This is for our first fairness notion, which is statistical parity. And that's the one that is looking at the difference in predicted outcomes across racialized groups. So to achieve statistical parity, the racial category shouldn't be correlated with the outcome, essentially. And here we see the red line is with race included in the model, and blue is with race excluded from the model. On the x-axis, we see this is accuracy, our F1 score, and on the y-axis, we see fairness. So first, you can see this trade-off that as accuracy increases, fairness decreases. Okay, so there is a trade-off between accuracy and fairness in the model. But you can also see that it doesn't actually matter whether race is in the model or not, for either accuracy or fairness or their trade-off. You can see that the lines are very similar, the curves are very similar in both the magnitude and in the patterns that you see. So here's another fairness notion. This one's the equal opportunity. So this is the one looking at differences in false and negative rates. And similarly here we see a trade-off where as accuracy increases, fairness decreases. But you don't see very large differences in accuracy or fairness based on whether you include race in the model or not. There are some disparities here, but there's no clear pattern. So depending on how far along you go on the accuracy spectrum, you do see sometimes the race model is more fair, sometimes the race model is less fair, but very, very slightly. It's not a significant difference. And another way to understand the role of race in these prediction models is to look at, to use feature importance analysis to see how important are each of these variables in the model. So you might think of this as just, if you think of a linear regression, you think of the magnitude of the coefficients, of the absolute value of the coefficient, that's the feature importance. How important is this feature in the model? How much is it contributing to the model? So we conduct feature importance analysis on our 4 machine learning models, and these offer insights into the role of each predictor and contributions to the model. And similar to what we saw with the Pareto curves, race variables contribute little to college student success predictions. In fact, the only race variable found to have non-zero importance is Asian, and that's the 30th most important feature. So it's pretty far down if you list the features according to their importance in the model, or how much they're contributing to the model. White, Hispanic, more than one race, and Black follow, but they're all negligible in the model. Instead, leading indicators of bachelor's degree attainment are measures of academic performance like GPA, credits earned, standardized test scores, and non-academic factors like family income, parents' education, employment, frequency of computer usage. And so these are, you can just see, these are the features by their importance, and you can see these race variables are pretty far down in terms of level of importance. So one potential explanation for this limited importance of race variables in predicting college student success is that other predictors that are in the models are racialized, and they're capturing those racialization mechanisms that contribute to college student success. And that would minimize the role of the race variables themselves, right? If there are all these other variables in the models that are highly correlated with race. So that's our next question, is to what extent are race variables statistically associated with other predictors of college student success? And because our other predictors are at different levels of measurement, we use different statistical tests. So chi-square for categorical variables, Kruskal-Wallis for ordinal, and point biserial for our continuous variables. And the key findings for this question are that 84% of the variables included in these models to predict college student success are statistically associated with at least one of the race variables. So 84%, that's 36 out of 43. And among the 20 variables that contribute the most to the model, so if we look at that list from earlier, if we look at the top 20 variables there with the highest feature importance, they're all associated with at least one race variable, with the exception of gender. So all of the most important features in the model are statistically associated with race. The socioeconomic variables, including family income, parents' education, hours worked per week, and computer use, are associated with all of the race variables at a significant level, statistically significant. And all standardized test variables are associated with Black, Hispanic, and white. So the results from our study suggest that when you use many predictors to predict college student success, when you have a rich data set like we do in this ELSE data set, the inclusion of race variables has a negligible effect on both accuracy and fairness of the prediction models. The study also reveals, I mean, to a lot of us, it's not surprising, but it shows yet again the interrelations between racialization and all of these other variables related to college student success. Many studies of college student success prediction exclude sensitive attributes like race, and they specifically say that in the systematic literature reviews I was alluding to earlier. Many of the studies don't include race variables because of the potential bias they might introduce. But we shouldn't assume that just because there's no race variable in the model, there's no racial bias in the model, right? We shouldn't assume those models are free of bias just because they exclude the race variable. So the implications, and again, these are our opinions, that if race can be factored in, it's possible that data analysts can consider mitigation techniques in predicting college student success. So there are some mitigation strategies that we've tried out. They actually haven't been very successful, the ones we've tried. But that would be one reason to include race in the models, is to actually account for that racial bias and try to mitigate it. So one example of that is to upweight observations for racially minoritized students who are successful. So if there's underrepresentation of successful racially minoritized students in the data set, you can reweight those observations so they carry more weight in the model, and it accounts for that underrepresentation in the model. That might be one approach to mitigating bias. But in order to do that, you have to be race explicit, which you can also talk about the broader social and political context around that, around being race explicit in college student success predictions and their applications. But the findings also underscore the importance of informed inclusion and interpretation of predictors. So as you include all of these variables in the model to predict college student success, it's important to be aware that they are racialized and to think about how to interpret the role of those predictors. And also to collect data to better explain the disparities. So experiences within schools or classrooms, again, those types of variables are usually not included in these models. And insights like this, like what sorts of experiences do students have in their institutions or in the classrooms, are actionable. Those are actually things that we could do something about. So in conclusion, predictive models warrant greater attention in education than I think we've given them. At least for me, I know I hadn't thought about this very much at all until I started hearing about it in some of my policy implementation work. But these models are ubiquitous, both within our universities and across colleges and universities, different institution types, from community colleges to research universities. And they have the potential to reinforce and legitimize social inequities. And I'll highlight legitimize here because, as Kathy O'Neill writes in Weapons of Math Destruction, many poisonous assumptions are camouflaged by math and go largely untested and unquestioned. So these predictive models, because they're statistical models, a lot of us don't question the bias that might be present in these models, and that helps to legitimize them. So we might be more concerned about human bias in advising students in particular ways, steering them away from certain majors or certain courses. But we may not be aware that these models also have those biases that are baked into them. And because they're mathematical, that helps to legitimize them. And users are often given little guidance on how to use the risk score. So there's some qualitative data on this also, trying to understand how do academic advisors make sense of these predictive models, and how do they use them. And one of the things that we found is that users often have little guidance on how to interpret and how to use those risk scores. And it's important to acknowledge the limitations and potential biases of predictive analytics. And just this work contributes to a burgeoning literature on algorithmic bias in other social services, in criminal justice, and in other areas. And analyses can be applied to other sensitive groups. So here we focus on racially minoritized groups, but we've also looked at Pell Grant as a sensitive attribute. We could look at first generation status, we could look at gender, we could look at rurality, we could look at a lot of different other sensitive attributes where there could also be bias in the predictions. Right, and that is all. Thank you.
Policy that students get to speak first. For a minute. Not speak.
Well, maybe not. Like, how comfortable can I be? Going once, going twice.
We sort of have two.
Yeah, we did. We're pretty comfortable. I mean, I'm just here, a former student.
The thing that talk that's actually really helpful and like I've been dealing with similar issues with machine learning approaches to biological health outcomes and the way that we're approaching this race. So one of the kind of questions I have for you is like, also, are you considering how your factors, the features that you're training on might predict differently across groups and maybe how to exploit that? And one way that I've started to kind of look at this was a little bit completely different on the other end. I don't know how it would work with some of the education related variables, but at least from the biomarker approach, I'm finding that the same things that predict mortality for men are the same things that predict mortality for women. There's the features of so like if we train them on one group, we wouldn't actually work with one other.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you all are looking at that or thinking about that.
No.
One program that you might look at is a boosted decision tree, which is GXT boost. I can send you that code if you want.
Yeah, so I won't use the code, but my collaborator has used XGBoost before. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion about how the different predictors might predict outcomes differently across groups. Yeah.
As a part of the regularized,
Yeah.
right, tendency of these experiences.
I'd love to see anything you're working on, or if you have
Yeah, I
anything
can
written. Okay.
Bracelet with buttons, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, we could talk afterwards, but there's my email address too. Thank you.
Up another point, like a lot of models that I've looked at in education, but at the individual level, like I do a really good job of predicting outcomes for white kids, and like our models are our surveys. I mean, there's so much bias built into the data that we collect. So, and then it's sort of the same idea that like we're really good at predicting for groups for whom we have really good data. And so is it, so they're like where's the, do we need new data?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes. And so I think that allows us to see which specific predictors are predicting outcomes better for which groups. And then, yes, in general, I think we are missing a lot of variables that are more relevant for the experiences of racially minoritized students. And yes, that's what our results show, that the models are doing a better job of predicting student success for white and Asian students and not doing as good a job for racially minoritized students, which suggests we do need better data. And I suspect, I mean, we know from the higher education literature, I'm a higher education scholar, that those experiences, campus climate, really matter, and those are usually not included in these models.
This is absolutely fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to contain myself. Can you go back to the bar graph where you had a list of like 20 or more predictors? Like it was at the top. I just wanted to take a look at these. Because I guess my curiosity is that like, so you have this really rich data source where you're able to put all of these things into your model, but does that actually align with the kinds of models that are being used in higher education? Because I mean, some of this is really nuanced. Well, I think of it as nuanced, like percent white teacher. I thought I saw something like percent Black teacher or percent Hispanic teacher. So I'm wondering, is this much more nuanced and a much fuller model than what's actually being used, because then that's going to have implications for whether or not race is really altering that fairness and accuracy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It relates to the question earlier about how does this compare to the data sets that are actually used in practice. And we don't know very much about what, like what's in UT's model. I don't know. I'm trying to find out, but we don't know very much. And yes, like the variables you pointed out, I would imagine a lot of colleges and universities don't have access to data on percent Black teachers in the high school that the students went to. Yeah, that's a really good point. And so our caveat with our conclusion is, if you have a rich data set like ours, then race doesn't matter. But if you don't, then yes, I think that's really important to add also, that just to be very explicit, if you have a rich data set like this with highly racialized variables, then the race variables themselves don't matter very much. But there are probably a lot of instances where colleges don't have rich data like these on racialized experiences, even though pretty much everything's racialized, but don't have rich data, in which case the race variable probably does matter. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I mean, that could really change.
Yeah.
Whether or not you actually want to include race in the
Yeah,
model.
yeah.
Depending on how rich.
Yeah.
The measures are that they're using.
Me too.
I guess this is not my question, so don't count this as my question, but would be, I think it would be interesting to look at like what colleges are most likely to have access to, like run the same algorithm, but only using GPA, credits taken, like the things that we know they have access to versus like, white teacher in high school, right? Like they're not yet,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
yeah. Or even like they probably don't know the amount of time they spend on TV and videos, you know, like playing with the algorithm in that way.
Yeah,
I think might be really interesting.
that's a good suggestion. Just like a bare bones model with the basic features that almost all colleges and universities will have access to see how that changes.
And at what point?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure, for sure. Yep. I did have a question, sorry. I got stuck on there. I think my question is not necessarily about what you're doing here, but the way that colleges are thinking about what comes out of these models, right? And my question is thinking about structure. Do they at all use it? For sure, like, as you were kind of describing it, it sounded like they're using individual behaviors to then respond to individual students, right? How are colleges thinking about this? Are they ever using these algorithms to think about structural changes in the schools? For example, we see that when Black students enter this specific econ class, they all seem to be at risk for failure, right? And then are they thinking about the actual structure of the school in response in when using these, or is it just at an individual level?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know about this Dartmouth example. I want to read more about that.
It has to do with bringing back the SAT.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll have to check that out. I think in most cases it is at the individual level. Like sending that message to the student to remind them of deadlines, and so it's like individual level interventions.
Yeah.
But in other cases, I don't know if this would be considered structural, but it is providing more resources and more, like here at UT, more targeted interventions to those students. That feels a little bit more structural, and it's putting the onus more on the institution than on the student themselves. But a lot of, I think that gets at which variables should be included in these models, and a lot of these models only include individual level variables and not variables above the individual. So like classroom level variables, I think the interactions that students have with their professors really matter for whether they stay enrolled or not. And there are probably class level variables that could get at some of that. At the courses where Black students are less likely to be successful, for example, and a lot of these models do. Actually, I haven't seen any models that do include those types of variables. It reminds me of a quote, Ruha Benjamin, who wrote Race After Technology. She gave a talk here at UT in the College of Natural Sciences, and about just about technology and AI in general. But she touched on predictive analytics in higher education. She said, why don't we stop labeling students at risk and start labeling the faculty members or the institutions as putting certain students at risk, right? And I just think that's really important. It's so critical. I mean, this work is very technical, but I think there are so many different ways to use the outputs, which in some ways can be really beneficial and can actually enhance student success in ways that are equitable, and other ways can be really harmful. So it really depends on what you do with the outputs. And I'm really interested in that personally as a social scientist, in how these models are actually being used in practice. And that's something I've been thinking about as a potential next step. But I don't know too much yet about institutions that are thinking of this as a structural problem and using these the outputs, the insights from these models to address student success in a structural way.